Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 6, Lesson 10, Week 6 Recap. So we've done a lot of work this week on our game, and we've learned a lot more about Unreal Engine. To close out this week, I just want to make a few finishing touches to the game. All of these changes have already been implemented, and I streamed these changes on my channel. So if you're interested in watching the implementation of all these, feel free to go back and watch that live stream. But for this video, I'm just going to go through and review all of the changes that I made so that we can wrap out this week. The objectives for this lesson are to create a special attack for our player. We'll review everything we learned in week 6, and then I'm going to set a few bonus challenges so you can add a little bit more to your game before we close out this week. So we'll start this lesson right off with a challenge. I want to create a special attack for my ship, and I would like this to be handled by using the right mouse button. Now, I want to make sure that we're using good object-oriented practices, so I want to make sure that this can be a swappable attack so that the player can change it out maybe at the customization screen, or you could have a different attack for each ship. The attack must have a cooldown, meaning that the player can't just repeatedly use it, and you can implement any type of cooldown that you want for your game. And we need to have a UI indicator on our HUD that allows the player to see when the attack is available. So if you want to take some time to do this challenge on your own, you can pause the video now and try this. I'm going to walk you through what I did, but if you still need a little bit more help, please feel free to go back and watch the live stream so you can see me do this. And just to show you what the special attack looks like, when I press the right mouse button, the player is going to launch a bunch of missiles into the world, and then the cooldown will start, and you can see it with that green progress bar by my ship health. Now, to implement this, I created a new actor class called Special Attack Base, which just has one custom event called Special Attack that's fired right on begin play. And in the Special Attack Base, just for debugging, I just set up to do a print string and then destroy itself. Now with this implementation where I'm spawning a new actor into the world, I always want to make sure I'm destroying that actor so that there's not a bunch of these hanging out in our level. So for the Missile Flurry special attack that I created, I overrode this special attack event, and then I have it doing a set timer by function name, which is fire missile. And this is on a timer of 0.05 seconds, which means it'll fire 20 times in a second, and it's looping. The implementation here isn't anything special. Basically, I have the number of missiles, which is a settable variable. And so I'm checking to make sure that this is still above 0. And then I'll decrement one of the missiles and then spawn a rocket into my scene, which the rocket is the same one we're using for the rocket launcher or the missile launcher. And I'm just getting a random integer in range from 0 to 360, so it's somewhere randomly around the player. So this is just going to fire off a bunch of missiles in quick succession. When we get to the last missile, what I need to do is go to my player ship and set a cooldown, because this actor is going to be destroyed, so we need to set the cooldown on the player ship. So I have a function there called set special cooldown, and the input of that is the cooldown, which is set on this Missile Flurry actor, a variable on our base class of Special Attack Base. And this will allow us to have flexibility of having different cooldowns for different abilities. So maybe you have some special abilities that are much more powerful, but they can't be used as often in your game. And the last thing, as I said again, we want to make sure that we're destroying this actor after the special ability has been triggered. And back in player ship, it's just a quick implementation. We have a new custom event called Fire Special Attack. It's going to make sure that our cooldown is 0. And then if it is, we're just going to get the actor location of ourself. We're going to spawn an actor, and this is going to be equipped special attack, which is a variable that's on our player ship now. Again, this will allow you to swap it out at the customization screen, or you can have a different special attack for each ship. And then, as you remember, we were setting the special cooldown on our player ship. So all that's doing is taking the input from our special attack base. We're going to set the special cooldown remaining to that number, which is now a variable on our player ship. And then we're going to set a timer by function, which is decrement cooldown timer for 1 second, and it's looping. And all this is doing is seeing if it's above 0. If it is, we're going to decrement it. And then once it hits 0, we will clear that timer. And the last little piece of info here is that we need to get our player ship. I'm using a validated get, so if the player ship is dead at the time, this will not fire. And we're just calling that special attack. So we went from the end to the beginning. Now let's just go back through from the beginning to the end just to make sure that we're comprehending. When the player presses the right mouse button, we're going to do a validated get on the player ship. If the ship is valid, we'll fire special attack. On player ship, this is going to check that the cooldown is less than or equal to 0. And if it is, we're going to spawn an actor of type BP special attack into the world. BP special attack base has one event called special attack, which we're firing on begin play. And here I've made a BP missile flurry, which is a child of that. We're overriding that event and we're calling set timer by function name of fire missile, and it's going to fire 20 times per second. This is checking to see the number of missiles remaining. If there are more than 0, then we're going to decrement that number and we're going to spawn a rocket into the world. Once that number reaches 0, we'll call set special cooldown on our player ship and we're going to destroy the special attack actor. Set special cooldown is going to take that input and set it to special cooldown remaining and then call decrement cooldown timer, which is going to go every second on a loop. And all this is doing is checking to see that if the number is still above 0, we're going to decrement it. And once it hits 0, we'll clear that timer. So hopefully you were able to follow along with all that. If not, please feel free to go and watch the live stream where you can see me do all of this in real time. So we learned a lot this week. We created a currency component, which we set up to allow the player to do upgrades to their ship in the game. We learned about structures and data tables, and we set up our loot system for that. We created a ship modifier system so the player can modify their ship while they're playing the game. We created a gun boss, so we learned a little bit more about setting up some different AI. And then we created a ship selection screen where we learned about the game instance class and how to pass information between levels. So this is the end of week 6, and I would like to challenge each of you to take some time and put some additional work into your game. These are some of the things that I came up that you could do. You don't have to do all of them, but they're just some ideas to get your brain turning and putting more work into this game and trying to think outside the box. So one of the things I want to challenge you is to switch to the enhanced input system. Now, this came out right before I started this week, and I didn't quite understand it yet, but it's been a bit since I started this project. And since then, I've learned the enhanced input system, and I think this is a great tool to learn. So I would challenge each of you to take some time and switch all of your inputs to this in your game. And if you want to see me do this, I actually did it on my live stream, so you could watch that and see me kind of struggle with this. It was a little bit of a challenge for me to remember how to swap a game that was not using it to a game that was using it. I think it'll give you a good understanding of the process. I'd like to challenge you to take some time to invest in your level design, put some finishing touches on your level, make it interesting, make it challenging for the player, maybe even make more than one level so that the player can start at level 1 and continue on. Another thing is we may want to spend some time balancing the loot drops. I know that the way we set it up, it was picking randomly between 3 things, but I think the number of times it drops a weapon is probably far too many. So we can balance this to drop currency more often and drop weapons less often. You can take some time to create some additional weapons and pickups, so you can do an armor refill, an extra ship, a laser beam that fires like a continuous stream of laser, an unguided missile that maybe does a little bit more damage, or an AoE weapon that maybe causes damage to an area or sends out projectiles in an arc. And then if you want to, you can create some additional special attacks that the player can equip at the selection screen, or you can have a different one for each ship. Now, I've done some of these on the live stream, so I'll take some time now to walk you through some of the ones that I implemented so that you can see my implementation. And if you would like more information, you can go back and watch that video. So like I said, I spent some time setting up the enhanced input system. Here you can see that I have my input mapping context for all of my inputs. And then you'll need a different input action for each of the inputs that your player will use. So here I have horizontal movement, vertical movement, fire main weapon, fire special weapon, and autopilot. So these are the buttons that we had set up so far. And when it comes to the actual blueprint, it looks very similar to the old system. So we're still going to get that action, and all I had to really do for this was swap out all of these with the one that was already there. And you can see here the autopilot, and then fire main weapon and fire special weapon. The way this works is you set up a different input action for each action that you want to have happen, and then those are what's set up in the player controller, or in our case, the player camera class. And these handle what happens when that button is pressed. The input mapping context maps these actions to a button or to multiple buttons. So if you're going to launch your game on several platforms, the beauty of this is that you can just set up the IMC and it will handle it for each platform specifically. For mine, I only have it set up for PC, but if I wanted to, I could easily set this up for a gamepad or for a touchscreen as well. And this looks very similar to when we're setting this in project settings. So we take our input action and then we map it to the keys. And so for this one, W would call this input, but S we have set up to call it in the negative. So it's going to do the opposite of what W does. And this is the same for A and D. D is calling the positive version and A is calling the negative version. And to do that, we just had to change one setting in this input action. This is normally set to a bool, which is just going to check whether it's true or false, and we just had to set up to a float. And that will allow us to do positive and negative. The only other thing that you need to do to make this all work is that on your player controller, in our case is the ship controller, we need to get player controller and then get the enhanced input local player subsystem. I'm checking that this is valid just because when I was doing this, I was troubleshooting a lot. And then we want to add mapping context to this subsystem of IMC input, which is this IMC that we set up. So just as a kind of review, you need to set up a different IA for each action that your player will take. And then the IMC, you link those actions to what buttons can trigger those actions. And then in the ship's controller, you just need to get access to the subsystem and then map it to the IMC that you set up. And there is one final step to get this to work. The enhanced input is a plugin, so you just need to make sure that you go to your plugins and enable this. And once you do this, you may have to reset, but then once it's enabled, it should be working every time. And that's just a quick rundown of getting the enhanced input system set up. The next thing I wanted to do was balance the loot drop, so I wanted to make it drop the currency much more often than weapons. And to do this, it was pretty simple. I just take an integer between 0 and 9, and then I want to check if it's equal to 0. So 10% of the time, this is going to equal 0. The other 90% of the time, it's going to not equal 0, which means we'll be on the false, in which case we'll just spawn the loot currency. And this was already set up in a previous lesson. This is going to randomly select a loot from our loot table, so we don't need to spend any time on that. However, I did set up a few additional loots so the gameplay would be a little bit more interesting and diverse. So I set up an extra ship loot, which gives the player an extra ship. I set up an armor refill that will refill the player's armor. And then I set up this power rocket as a third weapon that could possibly drop. And I'll just go through all of those. So on our loot base class, we have this collect loot function. So I've overridden that on this extra ship, we're just getting access to the player camera, getting the number of ships, incrementing it, and then the parent, which is to destroy the loot. Armor refill is fairly similar. I just overrode that collect loot function, get access to the health component, and then call reset health, which just sets the current health back to max health. And then again, destroy the loot. And the last thing is I set up a third weapon, which is this power cannon. The only thing I changed was the fire rate to 0.8, so it doesn't fire them as often. And we're spawning power rocket, which is a new projectile that I set up. And the only difference here is that it does quite a bit more damage and it flies a little bit slower, and it's an unguided missile. So that's setting up our loot table and making it a little bit more interesting. And so that'll pretty much wrap up this week. I hope you've had a lot of fun this week. I hope you're enjoying this project. In week 7, we're going to be learning about source control, which opens a lot of doors for you as a game developer. It's going to allow you to collaborate on your projects with other developers so that you can be working at the same time on the same project. And it also allows you to create a backup of your project so that if something were to happen, you would always have some type of backup for your project, meaning if the files became corrupted or if your computer became damaged and you lost access to the files, you would always be able to go and find your project files. So that's a big core of what we're going to be doing in week 7. However, we will be applying some of those concepts to this project and putting a few more finishing touches on it before we close out week 7. So thank you so much for watching so far. I hope you're enjoying this, and I'll see you in the next week.